And with singing like that, we're just reminded over and over again that those who are on the way to heaven, those who know the awesome God, know that the greatest thing really is to be a child of his. I want you to open, if you will, your Bibles to a wonderful book out of the New Testament. I want you to go to the book of Hebrews with me in chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. One of the things that we learn in Hebrews is the simple fact that some people needed to do some growing up and maturing, and he brings up some pretty meaty subjects to, I think, help make that happen. And that God used the writer of the book to help us understand that the Christian life, has two sides to it. There is the restful side of Christian living, and there's the wrestling side to Christian living. And, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And we like passages like that, don't we? If you're tired, if you're weary, you think, wow, I really like it when Jesus said that. Or over in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 7 says, "Be anxious for nothing. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." There's a rest and a peace side of Christian living. And we enjoy reading about it. We enjoy knowing about it. We enjoy having that as part of our life. But there's a wrestling, struggling side to Christian living that, well, maybe we don't talk enough about, and yet the Hebrew writer brings it up for us. And Jesus said, if you remember with me in Luke chapter 13 and verse 24, he says, "Strive to enter by the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able." Now, the word strive there is kind of an interesting word because it's to agonize. It's to wrestle, to struggle. And there's a struggling, wrestling side to Christian living that I think the Hebrew writer wants us to look at here in chapter 12. At the end of his life, you remember Paul, who said in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7, he says, "I fought the good fight. I finished the course. I have kept the faith." Keeping the faith is a fight that has to be fought. It's a race that has to be run. There is some input, there is some struggling, there's some wrestling, there are difficulties, because the two sides that the Hebrew writer, I think, wants us to look at they're not related in a way that you and I are going to rest one day and the next day we're going to wrestle, but the day after that we get to rest again. That's not the picture that the scripture is giving us, that there's going to be times when you're just wrestling and struggling and wrestling. And then there's going to be some times where in your Christian life there is that rest and there's that peace that we're talking about. And I think, with them being interwoven, you and I are not surprised if we have a struggling day, a wrestling day. And we're not surprised if we have a day where we're at peace and where we're at rest in our Christian spiritual life. And so when these things are happening to us, they're not a surprise to mature Christians. Now remember, the Hebrew writer is writing to some, not all, but some who were struggling with growing up, being mature, being grown up in their Christian walk, and having their faith at a level to where they understood some of these things. But when we see these two parts of our Christian life, they're interwoven in a couple ways. And probably the first way, or the main aim of our wrestling days, is so that we would enjoy the rest days. If you're struggling, if you're hurting, it's nice to have a day where you're not struggling and you're not hurting. You see, if we could have a rest in God, by the way, our rest is not in money. Our rest is not in a position that we're able to get at work or somewhere else. It's not, our rest is not, our aim is not in achievement, or, our wrestling is to get to the rest that we have in the promises of God, and not the promises that sin dangles in front of us. And the second thing that I notice is that all of our wrestling and all of our fighting and struggling and all the running that's implied here in Hebrews is done, with a deep restfulness of spirit that Christ himself has already won. And so you and I get to rest in that. We know that Jesus had that decisive victory where he died on the cross. He was buried in the grave. He rose again, as we have just been singing about right here. And he is sovereignly working in our behalf, and he's going to bring us too to glory. And so we rest in that. Even though in our life we may be having one struggle after another, and we're kind of confused and would like to have a better understanding of that. That's why I'm saying I want you to know that the book of Hebrews is a very mature, a very sober book to look at when we're studying the scriptures, especially if you're at a point in your life where you have been through some struggles and pain, or get ready, you may be looking forward to some days down the road where you struggle and you have difficulty and you have pain and you don't understand all the reasons behind it. Part of what Hebrews is doing is helping us be grown up when those things happen to us in the past, in the present, or down the road somewhere. And so, this endurance that we run the race and we fight the fight so that all of us can say one day that we finished well, that we did what God had asked of us. Now, this is not a book, by the way, it's not a book that teenagers often turn to. Or it's not a book that a lot of people who have not had any struggles in their life and they're still relatively young and they're strong. And so they would gravitate to maybe reading, if they were reading a book of the New Testament, one of the other books, not Hebrews. But people who struggle, people who've had difficulties, they'd like to have some explanation on how that relates to Christian living. How does that fit in with God's plan? In other words, the more easy and pain-free your life has been, the less that you're going to really cherish and hang on to the spirituality that's taught here in the book of Hebrews. Now, having said all of that, the more you suffer and the more you're going through trials and difficulties, the more you'll cling to some of these mature teachings. All right? And I've really tried to underline the fact that we're talking about a subject that's a mature subject. Yeah, you guys are with me. See, that's why I saved this for the Sunday night bunch. Because not your age, your spiritual maturity is pretty high. And so this is the kind of stuff that we really gravitate to and really treasure in our heart. But the more you study something like this, the big question, and it's a big if I read and study and understand this, am I willing to believe it wholeheartedly? And that's a big if. Because it's one thing for us to hear a lesson like I'm sharing tonight. It's another thing for you to read this passage on your own. But it's another thing with that big if right here. Do I believe in what it is saying? I remember talking to a person one time after a Bible class who had a question, and they said they were studying with a friend of theirs, and they came across a passage in Hebrews, and they were really wrestling and going back and forth with one another, because they were having difficulty and trouble settling right here. How is God in charge, and how does God allow this? And so they were talking back and forth, and he told his friend, he says, if you would believe this. And I said, there's the big question. Is not will you read it, not will you clearly understand it, but will you believe it and make it part of your faith? That I believe this, that I'm hanging on to this, that I'm living by this. Will you accept the mystery of God's providence when it's laid out for you in regards to pain in your life or struggles or difficulty? Will you be trained by it? So that when things happen to you or to someone else, you have an understanding. Or will you choose to kick against what the chapter says and say, I'm not ready to believe that yet? Or I believe something other than what it says there. Because if you do, then what do you do with the suffering that the Bible teaches us that God gives that's talked about in this chapter? If you look beginning at verse 3 right here in Hebrews chapter 12, I think it's really important that if we approach verses 3 through 11 kind of like this. First of all, I want you to notice, what the pain is mentioned and the sorrow that's mentioned in this part of the chapter. And then we're going to ask, what kind is it and where does it come from? And then finally, we're going to look at that, what we're going to ask, if it has a purpose or a design, what is it? So imagine with me, since I'm not going to pick on any of you because you're so mature, that you know someone who's struggling and wrestling, and they're in pain and they're in sorrow and they're really wrestling with their faith. And I want you to notice that there's a thread of suffering that's running through this particular section of Scripture. All right? And I want you to keep in mind that you guys are mature, and so you know a lot. This means yes. Yeah, you know a lot. All right. So for example, that earlier in chapter 11, when it was talking about the Old Testament believers, that they were some, by the way, who really, they went through tortures and they were mocked, and some were whipped, and some were thrown in prison, and some were destitute, and some had their homes taken away where they became homeless. And then before chapter 12 starts out, in verse 1, we have this invitation for all of us to lay aside all sins and weights and run the marathon of biblical love and holiness. All right, you guys, I see a couple of nods. 2 of you know what I'm talking about. The rest of you stay with me, and we'll try to make it clear. But we're going to have fun with this chapter, or at least this part of the chapter, okay? Because if you notice right here, that there are saints lined up along the route of your life. And they're cheering for you because they're saying to you, you can do it by faith. You can do it with the faith that you have in God. You can do it with the faith and the understanding and the love that you have for God. And so verse 2 comes along and says, and if that's not enough, look to Jesus, who, just like these Old Testament saints, endured a horrible death and was shamed, but he set his eyes on the joy that was set before him. Wow. And I know you are familiar with that. And then he brings the legacy of suffering up to date. And he applies it to all the believers of his day, which means you and I can apply it to our day. All right? And so in verse 3, he says, consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. Now, the first glimpse we have here of suffering, we see here in the church, here's something that's threatening them. Our brothers and sisters were being threatened, and they were growing weary, and some were losing heart over what they were dealing with. The struggle, the difficulty. And it's normal, by the way, for all Christian men and women to have experiences where we're stress-filled, where we have moments where we're suffering, and those moments threaten our faith. What you believe in is challenged when you're hurting. When you're full of stress, when you're struggling and you're wrestling and your faith is being tested here, and if it's pressed too long and too hard, then all of a sudden it almost gets to where you feel it's intolerable. I'm a person who's trying to walk by faith. Why is this happening to me? What's going on? I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to handle it. I prayed about it, and it still seems to be there. Losing heart is a great spiritual danger. And it's one that all of us face from time to time. You say, well, Tom, you don't know how strong my faith is. You let it be tested for a long time. And then come back and tell me, Tom, let me tell you how strong my faith is. There are Christians who were in danger then of giving up their faith, and there are Christians in danger today in giving up their faith. And it was written for us to have an understanding, because when we take another glimpse at the suffering they're going through, and the reference is to the hostility against Jesus in verse 3, it says, consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself. Now, why are we supposed to consider this? Because the same kind of thing is happening to you and to me, and we need to get strength from knowing that Jesus went through it. When we cry out to our Father, Jesus knows exactly what we've gone through and what we're going through. Now, another glimpse, we look at verse 4. He says, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. And the point here is things are bad, but they're not as bad as they could be. All right? There is hostility, there's trouble, there's stress, and there's suffering. But evidently, by this time in the scripture, there's been no martyrs yet. And we know from the book of Hebrews earlier in chapter 10, verse 34, that some had been put in prison and some had had all their belongings plundered. But it's not yet seemed like anyone has died the martyr's death here, though that could come to any one of them. And the stress level, I guess this is what's really hard when you're reading Hebrews, is it put the stress level up to here. It is big time stress. And it's one of the reasons why some of our earlier brothers and sisters were ready to quit. Some were even thinking, let's go back to Judaism because that was comfortable. And the Hebrew writer is telling them here that even though the stress level is huge, I mean, I know it's difficult for some of you to sleep at night being a Christian man or woman because you're fearful of a mob violence or whatever might come your way. But there's another glimpse. Jump down to verse 11. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, understatement, but sorrowful. In other words, the present experience that you're going through is sorrowful, and joy has been covered up with this dark cloud of pain and suffering. And the word seems, by the way, discipline seems not to be joyful. I mean, that kind of hints at the idea that there is some kind of joy that you could see if it wasn't covered up with all the difficulty and stress and problems. That there is there's a joy in Jesus, there's a hope to hang on to, but it's underneath the cloud of everything that's happening here. It's kind of like, some of you parents have to help me out. Do you remember one time when you spanked your child? It used to happen. Well, it still does in some circles, but don't spread it around, okay? But do you remember after a spanking, there was a joy, but you just couldn't see it at the moment? Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that the believers that we're looking at in this passage are under tremendous stress, and they're enduring some form of hostility, and they're wrestling with great sorrow, and they're in danger of growing weary of the battle and losing heart. And the whole book of Hebrews is written by the writer that God chose to prevent that from happening. Now, there's another thing I want us to ask, and that is what kind of suffering that this is all about, and where did it come from? And the first answer is the suffering is coming from hostile adversaries. You guys got that already, didn't you? All right. Now, that was true back in chapter 10, verses 32 through 34 right there. It's true of the Old Testament saints and what they struggled with in chapter 11, beginning in verse 35 there. And you can see that it's true in a connection here between verse 3 and 4. Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. The link between Jesus and the hostility from sinners, you know, you too have resisted this from time to time. You've had people make fun of your faith. You've had people make fun of you going to church when you should be doing something else that they think is more fun. And so we felt hostility and being made fun of and stuff, but not to the point that any of us have shed our blood in our battle against sin. But the suffering is viewed here as persecution in a lot of different forms, just short of martyrdom, okay? But where did all this come from? Who's doing this? Who's in charge of all of this? And the first answer in verse 3 is, consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners. See, now this is what Jesus endured. This is what you and I are enduring from time to time, the suffering and the difficulty that comes our way because of the hostility of sin-choosing people who want their life to be predominant and not yours, who want their way of thinking to be the dominant one. So the suffering is coming, and the hostile, will of sinful adversaries is out there. So that's the first answer, but that's not the main one that we need to look at. It's not the decisive one, because this whole passage is built on another answer to the question, where does the suffering come from? And who's doing this? Who's in charge? And the main answer of the passage is that God is in charge here. He's in ultimate control of the afflictions. And they are, in fact, I'll get ready, loving discipline from God. What? I thought you said these sin-choosing people were affecting me and then making my life miserable. And yeah, but watch what verse 5, 6, and 7 says. That one of the reasons why our brothers and sisters then were growing weary and losing heart is that you have forgotten that the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. Watch this. My sons, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. I wish we had time. We'd go to Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12, which talks about this very thing. But in other words, what we're looking at here is what adversaries do to you out of their sinful hostility, God is doing out of his fatherly discipline. Now, I know, I can tell by a few faces you're having a hard time wrapping your mind around this. But stay with me, because it's really important for knowing your God in a biblical way and living out your life by faith in times of suffering. And it's going to come sooner or later. Just for the fun of it, how many of you have known someone who has gone through tremendous suffering? Okay, everybody who was willing to put their hand up, and the rest of you were saying, I wouldn't dare put my hand up. I don't care if he was asking who wants more money. There are some, okay. But we love you too, okay? But notice really careful with me here that this passage does not say that God is looking on while hostile sinners beat up and hurt his people, or while Satan comes in and ravishes the elect, of his people. And then he steps in and turns all that evil that happens to you for good right here. That's not what this passage is saying at all. It's totally a different, concept of what's happening to you and I and to them. And it's recorded so that you and I can get a hold of it so that we can be more prepared when something does happen. Because watch what it says here. It says that God is disciplining us. Now, none of us like that idea. We don't like the idea that God is a disciplinarian and we're the target. We're going to be disciplined. That he's teaching us, that he's correcting us, that he's transforming us. See, here's where we have difficulty. God has a purpose and he has a design in what's happening to his people. Whether it's here in Michigan or whether it's somewhere else, he has a design. And he's the ultimate doer in this passage right here, because the end of verse 6 goes so far as to say that God scourges every son whom he receives. Don't like the sound of that one. But I do want to be one of his sons. Now, who's scourging in that verse? Who's the one doing the whipping? Yeah, God is. See, God is not a passive observer in my life while sinners come along and try to influence me and make fun of me and make my life miserable, and Satan comes along and beats up on us in his way right here. See, God rules over sinners and over Satan. God rules. And they unwittingly, and with no less fault or guilt, by the way, they fulfill his wise and loving purposes of discipline in our lives. See, the big question tonight is who's in control? God is. I have talked to people who don't want to believe what I've already said, and we're not even done with Hebrews. But there are some people who just don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe it, so I'm not going to accept it. They say God's not in charge of evil. That just happens to us. He has given the world over to Satan and the free will of men and women, and he's not at work. You know, the hostility of sinners is real. It's wrong, and they're responsible, and they're guilty. You know, wait a minute. This passage is designed to give you and I a bushel basket full of hope so that we can have it when we need it. There's not a one of us that doesn't want more hope. Well, get ready, because here it is. You know, this is great hope. It's a loving Father who painfully is disciplining us for our good. And we can hope on that. See, God is not coming into the lives of his children after they've been attacked and beat up on and stuff. And, you know, and he's not saying, well, I'll take this beating up and I'll turn it into good. No, he's saying here, see, that's not discipline at all. Because think with me for just a second. You know, that would be God doing repair work. I heard a man illustrate it this way one time. He says the difference between a surgeon who plans the incision in you for your good and the emergency doctor who sews you up after a freak accident. Now, this passage says that God is the doctor who's planning your surgery. And lovingly, he's not a doctor who's running in and repairing all your lacerations. He's the one who's planning the surgery needed in your life and in mine. It's his plan being worked out. Somebody says, well, you know, does that also apply to you know, natural calamities that we see on the news and stuff, and sicknesses that I hear people, you know, all of a sudden they find out they've got that they didn't have before right here, that's not caused by the hostility of sinners whatsoever? How am I supposed to look at this suffering and these trials and stuff, you know, when it comes to God's overarching discipline of his children for their own good? I'm having trouble with all of this. I want to answer that with this question before I close. Which is harder to attribute to God's design? The hostility of sinners against God's people, or the destruction of a hurricane? Which is harder for you to attribute to God? Now, I find that the hostility of sinners is more difficult to attribute to God's design. And the reason is that in both cases, you know, the hostility and the hurricanes, you've got to deal with the pain that's caused by the event. But in the case of hostility, you have to put an added difficulty there, that people's wills are involved there. And in the case of, a hurricane, you don't have that difficulty because no human agent is causing the hurricane, but a human and their will is connected to the hostility that comes from them. So if we say that God is governing the hostility of sinners against the saints, we imply that he governs not just the natural effects, but human wills and what harm they can bring to your life and to mine. And that's what this passage is saying, Tom, I want to teach you. What hostile sinners mean for harm, God means for good. What they will as hurtful, God wills as helpful. What they plan as destruction, God plans for our salvation. And what they design to deter your faith, God designs as discipline to increase your faith. I see in this passage a really precious teaching that God reigns over all the hazards of circumstance, over the health of our bodies, over the hostility of our adversaries, and he designs all of life ultimately as a loving father would discipline you and I to be stronger, more obedient in the faith. Your pain, your struggles are in your life and mine, not because we're a slave, not because we're an enemy of God. We're being treated as a loved child of God. He loves you. He loves me. And the real issue tonight is will we believe it? Will we believe in our difficulties that we're still God's loved child? Or will we put God in a corner and start accusing him of mistreating us and not doing us fair? You see how easy that would be? I shouldn't have to suffer like this. I shouldn't have to struggle like this. I don't want to go through another wrestling day or another wrestling week or another wrestling month in my spiritual walk right here. He's willing to do more for us than we realize, because in verses 10 and 11, he says that he disciplines us for our good, that we might share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful. That's an understatement, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Notice 4 words and I'm done. It's for our good, it's for our holiness, it's for our peace, and it's for our righteousness. That's the design of a loving father. It's that God who loves you so much that he sent Jesus Christ to this earth in his wonderful plan to die on a cross, to be buried in a tomb, to rise up from that grave so that you and I can be offered forgiveness of sins. It might be tonight that you're ready to put Christ on in baptism because of your study of the word. And if that's the case, we'd love to assist you if you'll come while we as a church stand and sing this song. Will you come?